Permaculture is essentially a design science that grew up outside of the academy and outside of business. There's a lot of ways that you can learn from what permaculture is teaching, not just biologically, but also socially. And one of the other issues is essentially to learn from nature itself, to look at nature's natural processes and try to duplicate them and try to actually work with them instead of against them, because so much of how we've developed with our mechanical industries, et cetera, has been to suppress and control nature instead of seeing that nature's works pretty hard. And if we let nature do more of the work and we get behind that and kind of work with it, we might be able to work less. You go back 400 years, and of course there's this whole other moment where we were living through what I'm actually arguing is an epistemological shift. The epistemology referring to how do we know what we know. And we know the world differently today, in 2008, way differently than we even knew it in 1988. And we have all this common sense that we've developed about ecological processes and sensibilities and how we might insert ourselves into that and work with it and be changing some of the basic technological bases of our society. And these are just kind of deep knowings that a lot of us have in our everyday lives. It does not show up in the politics. You don't see any politician talking about this. You don't read about it in the newspapers very often, except as sort of like weird projects up here getting a feature article. You certainly don't hear any corporate agendas adapting to this. It has nothing to do with what capitalism wants to do. And so you go back to the end of the Middle Ages, and you had this period of time in which what was then known as natural philosophy, who later came to call it science, was becoming contested by lots of different players, lots of different people. And some of the people that were doing that were actually what we now call artists, like Da Vinci or Duret or Palissy. And what they did that nobody had ever done before was they made perfectly rendered pictures of human anatomy and plants and nature, items in nature. That had just never been done. And they didn't do it because they liked drawing. They had pretty pictures. That wasn't the point at all. They thought they were engaging in a popular discussion about the nature of natural philosophy. What is it that we are here on Earth? And they saw themselves, and they used this language, reading the book of nature. And that's exactly the language that the permaculturists are now using 400 or 500 years later. It's fascinating to think that we had to go all that time to come back to this basic sensibility. And the other key piece of that sensibility was to understand that everything's connected and everything's alive. And that we're in a web of life that is completely, you can't sever it. If you do, you're severing something in yourself. Permaculture then has this kind of thriving scene going on, sort of, in some of the stuff that Scotty was talking about, you see that there's all these experiments and projects going on that are very practical, that are giving you things you can do in your immediate life. Harvesting rainwater being a great example. It shows up a lot in urban gardening and horticultural practices going on in urban environments. And so I have a whole chapter in my book on vacant lot gardening, because I saw this as a kind of an interesting example of the reemergence of a commons in urban spaces that has all these kind of interesting pieces to it. Of course, it becomes the site of food production for a great number of people. It's also the site of community production. People meet each other. They come together in these spaces. But in any case, in North America, back in the Gilded Era, the first one, as wealth had been incredibly polarized and some people had it all and the rest of them had almost nothing, a lot of people were desperately poor and starving, and there was no safety net whatsoever. And living in the margins of society, these wealthy people would get kind of disgusted about all the poverty around them, and they would say, you people should really lift yourself up by your bootstraps. Why don't you go over there and take that vacant lot and grow a little food? By World War I, then, there was a huge push by the federal government to get people growing food. For the victory in the war, you should all participate by growing food. And literally, millions of dollars and millions of pounds of food was grown in just a 2-year period from 1917 to early 1919 at the instigation of the government. That really comes to fruition, pun intended, in 1940s for World War II, when you have the Victory Garden movement. In San Francisco, we had 70,000 Victory Gardens. It meant people took their lawns and dug them up and started planting vegetables and fruit. Every park that we had in the city was dug up and turned into vegetable gardens and fruit gardens. And so it's quite amazing the abundance that was grown in the United States to serve the domestic population. It was 40% plus of the fruit and vegetables eaten by Americans at the end of World War II was coming from urban food gardens. Of course, the end of World War II is, go back to Safeway and buy your cellophane-wrapped food. That was the plan. And for the most part, people did, and they put all the parks back to parks, and people put their lawns back to lawns, and most of that kind of went by the wayside, and it kind of was just lost and left behind. But you come forward and you get Rachel Carlsson in 1962 writing Silent Spring, and people are starting to be kind of freaked out about chemically soaked food and the sort of insanity of the Green Revolution and how bad that really is for soil and all sorts of different things, aquifers, et cetera. And so you get to the latter part of the 60s, and there's this famous moment in Bay Area where People's Park is seized by all these radicals, and the first thing they do is plant an organic garden. And it kind of inspires a lot of imagination all over the United States, and people start doing this all over the place. So you had suddenly a great number of abandoned properties that were essentially covered in rubble, with needles and broken glass and all that kind of stuff. But there were still people living there. They were the people left behind in this process of decomposition. Often people of color, often women-centered families. And they sort of looked at this situation they were in, pretty darn bleak, and they thought, well, we don't have to put up with this. Let's just take that empty lot. Nobody cares about it anymore. The city's repossessed it. Nobody's paying any taxes on it. It's empty. And let's just start making something for ourselves. And so they start clearing the land and planting gardens. And you have this incredible renaissance of urban gardening going on from the 70s onwards. And in New York City, you had over 1,000 gardens. In Boston, you got gardens. In San Francisco, we got over 100 of them. And all these different places, and it's just quite a beautiful thing. And these gardens become, interestingly, several different things. One is that they bring people together across race and age and class and all these kinds of barriers and categories that we really kind of work very hard to make sure we keep them up all the time in our self-segregating lives. But there's a place where people meet, and that something starts to happen there. There's a kind of different kind of communication, different possibilities of life. And they start growing food together and thinking of and sharing recipes and all those kinds of things that we kind of dream of, like, yeah, shouldn't it always be like that? And somehow we lost a lot of that over the years. But the gardens are one of the places that have really pushed in the other direction. But you come forward, and the New York stories being one of the more dramatic ones, of course, you get Rudolph Giuliani as the mayor in the early 90s, and he's like, you know, the wall has fallen and communism's over, and these gardens are basically communism, so we're going to get rid of them. And he says this out loud on the radio. I mean, that's what he said. And so he actually unleashes the police department to go in and start bulldozing these gorgeous community gardens. And why? They're not actually the commons, as people held them and thought of them as being, because they were still owned by the city. And the city's politician changed and decided that I'm not going to support what you're doing down there. We're going to take it away from you and sell it off to private developers because the city wants more tax revenue. And unless we can figure out how to actually remove things from private property and make them into common lands and really a trust, a land trust, if you will, is our best sort of in-between strategy in the near term. But in the long term, we should be thinking about how do we get common lands commonly held that we can actually share together and run democratically and start growing our own food. I mean, Scotty's point about that being just on the agenda, we have to really start thinking about that. And so this issue with the gardens movements that have been destroyed again and again because of the city and the private property interests coming back to bear has to be a little bit more savvy about addressing private property as the underlying institution that they're actually attacking and addressing when they do community gardens and establishment of new commons.